Welcome back to another edition of Tuesday's Thought. So happy to have you joining us this evening as we discuss the topic, the illusion of necessity. Won't you take a moment before we begin to do as I usually ask you to do, which is to share, like, subscribe, tag somebody, let somebody know that this thought is on, as it may be something that can be helpful to them. All right, the illusion of necessity. So I'm going to start this evening's thought out by sharing an experience I recently had. This happened just the other day, a few weeks ago, actually. So I went into one of my closets and I reached for a bag that I had put there quite some time ago. And it had a brand new item in it. Now, I remember purchasing it some time ago. It came back to my mind that it was there and it was something that I said, I can use this. So I went to go get it. Now, while I was removing this item from the bag that it was in, out fell the receipt. And so I took up the receipt, and of course, to my surprise, when I looked at the date on the receipt, and I don't know why I particularly did that. Normally, I would have just tossed it away because I had had it for such a long time. But I remember looking at the receipt, and when I saw the date on the receipt, I noted that the date was exactly 1 year to the date that I was opening up this package, right? So let's say I was opening it up on, August 1st. It was August 1st of last year. And what struck me as I looked at this receipt is that I started remembering the circumstances at the time that I was making this purchase. I remember, and this of course was a year ago, but at the time that I was making this purchase, this was an item that I felt I absolutely had to have. I needed this item. It was actually an item that I needed for my home. And I remember going to the mall, frantically searching for it. And I refused to leave until I had found one. And it was just something that I had to have. Okay, it was actually something for my room. It was bed linen. And in my mind, in that moment, I needed it. It was a specific color that I wanted. All of these things, I needed it and I had to have it. I had waited so long. I had been patient. I had put it off. Now was the time I needed to get this thing. I had to have it. But here we are, fast forward 1 year later, and I hadn't even opened the package. So how many times have we actually duped ourselves into believing in the necessity of obtaining a certain thing or things, right? Just like that example, only to look back in hindsight. And if you're honest with yourself, if we become honest with ourselves in the moment, we look back and we come to the realization that we felt so desperately that we needed this thing, when in fact that really wasn't the case. Okay? This is what I'm calling tonight the illusion of necessity. Okay? And when we think about an illusion, what is an illusion? Illusion is something that is a misrepresentation of reality. It's not real, right? In other words, it's your mind playing tricks on you, leading you to believe in something that just isn't. It's a fabrication, okay? And in my example, that's exactly what was taking place. At the moment I was making the purchase, my mind was telling me I absolutely needed this thing. But the evidence, 1 year later, the fact that I hadn't even opened, it wasn't in fact a necessity. Clearly, I found a workaround. I figured something else out. It wasn't until 365 days later that I pulled it out. So clearly it wasn't actually something that I fully and truly needed. right? Kids do that all the time. How many times have perhaps you heard from your children, I need this thing, I really want this thing, or it's something that they want to get for Christmas, that kind of a thing. And you go out of your way, you purchase the item, and not many days hence after they've opened it, not too long after, you see it balled up in the corner somewhere, or tossed aside. It's a new toy that they absolutely had to have. They received the toy, and not too long after, clearly they're done with it. They're through. Okay, that's in some ways very similar to the example that I gave as far as framing this discussion of the illusion of necessity. Now, don't be mistaken. We can, at various times, find ourselves giving into the illusion of necessity, not just with respect to things, right? So material things. In my example, it was an actual material thing. But the illusion of necessity can apply beyond just tangible things, right? We can believe, for example, wholeheartedly that we need to have a certain job or that we need to be in a certain position. We can believe, again, wholeheartedly that we need to have certain relationships or that we need a particular person in our life. Sometimes it's also in the reverse, not so much that we need a particular person in our life, but we can lead ourselves to believe that we are so desperately needed by someone that if we say no to that someone, or that, if we are somehow not present or not there every time that person needs something or asks you something, then, suddenly their whole world is going to come crashing down. So we're driven by this illusion of being needed by that individual or of needing someone. So again, it's beyond the scope of just tangible physical things. The illusion of necessity can extend outside of that. We can believe that we have a need to know, for example, right? You may know people in your circles who, for whatever reason, it will perturb them. They will lose sleep if they were not the first person to hear about the latest news, that type of a thing, right? If they're not in the know about what's going on, okay? Something internally is driving them to believe that there's an absolute necessity, okay? They need to have this information. So the illusion of necessity, as I say, is broad, okay? So I want you to think about it in broad terms. But most important, what I want you to take away from this thought tonight is that if we are not careful, feeding into this illusion of necessity can leave us bankrupt in so many ways, okay? Now, I'm talking equally to the person who feels that they need like that material thing, okay? So in my example, I felt like I had to go out and get that thing for my home, and I didn't really need it because a year later, I still hadn't used it, right? And it's anything, it can apply. So I'm speaking to the people who constantly, you might feel a need to constantly acquire things and get things. And the more you get is the more you need to have. I'm speaking to that situation as equally as I am speaking to the person who, as I said, may have a need to be in the know constantly, or may have a need to constantly have people around, or to constantly be in a certain type of position, or be in a certain relationship, right? If you're constantly seeing a need to acquire things, that can leave you, if you're not careful and if you're not financially sound, and if you're not a good steward of your resources, that could lead you into financial deficit. But equally, in the other examples, you can find yourself in an emotional deficit, in a spiritual deficit, in a psychological, mental, right? All of these other things. If you are constantly driven to indulge and engage these needs, which really aren't that. I want to anchor the thought in a text, but not a particular scripture. I want to highlight a parable that Jesus taught as he was teaching his disciples. This is a very, very well-known passage, and it's found in the book of Mark chapter 4. It's also in another gospel, but I'm going to focus on this one as highlighted in the book of Mark chapter 4. So let me just give you the background in a nutshell. Jesus presents to the audience a parable about a sower and a seed. So to use the vernacular of the time, a farmer who was planting seeds in the ground. And quickly, the story goes that the seeds as they were planted fell in different types of soil, fell in different ground, so to speak. Some fell by the wayside, some fell in thorny patches, some fell on stony ground, and some fell on good ground. The one I want to highlight, however, is the one that fell among thorns. Now, as Jesus is breaking down this parable, this is one of the few, actually, wherein he presents to the disciples the actual meaning of it. So he illustrates the point. He says it fell in, the seed fell in thorny ground. It fell among the thorns. And what ended up happening is the thorns choked the seed. It was growing, but it choked it. And as a result, there was no fruit that was produced off of this plant, let's call it, or from this crop. There was no fruit that came forth from it. And so the interpretation of it, he gives in the 19th verse. And he says, the seed, of course, represents the word of God. And it fell in a good place. It was well received by the hearers. The ground is the heart that heard and received this word. It was well received. But unfortunately, the thorns, they represented the cares of this world, or the worries of life, and the deceitfulness of riches. So in other words, accumulation of material possession, and the desires for other things. These things entered in and choked the word, and as a result, it became unfruitful. It did not bring forth fruit. Why is this? Well, if you think about it in practical terms, the illusion of necessity with respect to the cares of life, the things that I need to get done, just the day-to-day demands, the desire for accumulation of wealth and riches, an unhealthy desire, if I can characterize it that way, and the desires for other things. If these things are not properly situated, if they are fed by an illusion of being necessary, and we are overindulging in these things in our life, it can result in unfruitfulness. That's the point of that particular passage, as I draw the connection to this thought about the illusion of necessity. That encounter the other day that I had in my room, when I found that year-old receipt and looked at this package, which at one point I felt was an absolute need, and went out of my way to make sure that I had got it because it was needed in my home. When I think about it, it really did leave an impression on me, because it caused me to think, well, how many times do we expend time, resources, energy, worry, anxiety over things that we deemed to be necessary, or that we deem to be things that we must have, or that we must do, or that we must acquire, or that where we must be, etc., and so forth, when in fact, it really is just an illusion. The reality of the situation is, if I really, really think about this, it's not really necessary. And so all of the energy and all of the resources and all the time wasted, all the tears, all the laboring over it was really just a waste. Why? Because I fed in to the illusion of necessity. I hope that after we've heard this thought tonight, that we can reevaluate. And I think we're all guilty, if we're honest. We are all guilty of having those moments where we've mistakenly, I'll say that, prioritized certain things as being necessaries in our life. So I hope that in this thought, that we can reevaluate those things and save ourselves some grief, save ourselves from some of the pressures that we needlessly impose on ourselves because of the illusion of necessity. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Once again, my prayer for you is that the peace of God will be with you. Until we see you again next time, may God bless you.